usual analysis of most scholars is that nationalism is a phenomenon that can be dated as of the 19th century, and I don't really disagree with that. Before that we had states, but the idea of a nationalist sentiment on the part of populations in those states was very thin. We just go back to the France at the time of the French Revolution, where half the country didn't even speak French. There's a wonderful line in Shaw's Joan of Arc, in which he's having this discussion among people who are thinking of whether they should burn Joan or not burn Joan, and one of them says, "Frenchmen? You mean these Burgundians, these Picardians, etc., are calling themselves Frenchmen today?" Well, it's a bit anachronistic to put that into the 14th century, but that is in fact what begins. So you have to say, why does nationalism emerge? It clearly emerges as a method of unifying people within the state, of overcoming the class struggle within the strong states. We're all Frenchmen together, therefore we can all conquer the Algerians together and stop worrying about class relations within France, and to some extent that's extremely successful. And then it emerges in the periphery as a mechanism of struggle. We want to be equal with people in the rest of the world, therefore we need our state, and we have a nationalist movement and so forth. Greece is as good an example of this as any other, but I mean there are hundreds of examples of this. So nationalism becomes a kind of unifying mechanism of movements, and then gets translated. The new state comes into existence, and it tries very hard to impose a unified language, a unified culture, this and that, through two basic mechanisms. Incidentally, people forget this. One basic mechanism is the primary school. The other basic mechanism for men only has been the army, both of which are very successful in achieving nationalist objectives. But the recent phenomenon of nationalism in the post-Soviet world, that's basically where we talk about the recent phenomenon of nationalism, means in the Balkans, in the ex-Soviet Union and so forth, is I think a little different from the historical nationalism. Historical nationalism was incredibly optimistic. It said, if we achieve our state, then the world will be good, then we will achieve equality, then we will transform the world. It was a very kind of positively oriented phenomenon. When these structures fell apart, and particularly too Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union, and Czechoslovakia, which I point out are the only structures in Eastern Europe which were federal. Right? All the other structures were non-federal, and none of them fell apart. And the federal structures all fell apart according to the lines of the Federation. So they took existing units, political units. Right? Bosnia was there, Macedonia was there, Ukraine was there. They had a government, even if it wasn't an independent government. They had structures, and then they moved towards independence, at which point they moved towards internal coherence by trying to, they call it ethnic cleansing. That's only when it's nasty, but ethnic cleansing, of course, it goes on all the time, has always gone on. But it's an extraordinarily defensive, unoptimistic form of state building. Now, people are building these things because they're really frightened that somehow they'll be squeezed out, be hurt by the others, and so forth. I think that's that's somewhat different than what I think in the post-1968 period. Nationalism has lost its sheen as a liberation concept. Now you ask me about the end of states. I think that's quite different. That gets us into the discussion of the transformation of the world today. The states are still there for the moment. I think what's been undermined is the faith that the states are, in fact, effective mechanisms of transforming the world. Remember my basic position, that all historical systems have beginnings which need to be explained. We haven't even talked about that, but we won't have time. They have normal lives and they function according to certain rules which we can spell out. We haven't really even talked about that, but there's a lot to talk about. But then at some point they run into terminal crises. All systems do. All physical systems do. All biological systems do. And all historical social systems do. Nothing unusual, but you have to say, under what circumstances does this happen? The way I analyze this is I say, look, the way a historical social system functions, indeed probably the way any system functions, is that it has both cyclical rhythms. There are mechanisms within the structure which constantly bring it back to equilibrium. It goes up and then it gets pulled back down, goes a little bit under, goes picked up. This is what stabilizes a system. But at the same time, it has what I call secular trends. That is, the cyclical rhythms, for various reasons, never bring it back to exactly where it was, and then you can trace on a diagram, in fact, a kind of secular trend of the system in various ways. Well, if you trace secular trends and you draw them in terms of percentages, it's 20%, it's 30%, it's 40%, and then you reach what's an asymptote. 100%, nothing can be 110%, right? So systems moving up along that will reach a point where they can no longer move up along that line. They move up along the line to solve short-run problems, but the long-run problem is they approach the asymptote. And my argument is we're approaching several asymptotes simultaneously, all of which affect the possibility of accumulating capital. Well, globalization, of course, is rhetoric. It's a rhetoric of the last 15, 20 years. The argument of people who use the term is that indeed, yes, there's something new. When you ask them, what is this something new? On the one hand, they argue a kind of, what should I say, technological shift. We're in the information society and so forth. That, frankly, has never struck me as anything new. Obviously, information flows a lot faster than it used to, but the increase in speed of information and of transport has been a constant phenomenon of the last 400 or 500 years. It's part of the modern world system. It will continue. I'm not convinced. I'm not persuaded that that's new. The second thing that they point to that's new is that we all have to be competitive in the world market. Well, I think we've all had to be competitive in the world market for the last 5 centuries if we want to succeed in the world market. And the third thing that's pointed to as new is that production is somehow worldwide and no longer local. Well, actually, we did in my center a whole research project on the degree to which production of the key products in the 17th and 18th century was worldwide, so of the world economy at that time. So I don't think that's anything new. So in some sense, all the things that are pointed to as new are not new. At which point you have to say, well, why do people say these things? And that's what I mean by rhetoric. This is part of a political drive in the wake of both the Kondratiev downturn and the collapse of the Soviet Union and a number of other things, to argue the case for neoliberalism as state policy. This is the famous assertion of Mrs. Thatcher Tina, there is no alternative. It is an attempt to persuade governments that they cannot put up various kinds of blocks to the free movement of capital and the free movement of goods. Okay? Now, of course, the attempt to get freer movement of capital and freer movement of goods goes back 5 centuries. It's always pushed by people for whom that is at that moment advantageous, and always resisted by people for whom that is disadvantageous. And there's been a sign of cyclical phenomenon of more free trade, less free trade, more free movement of capital, less free movement of capital. That's been going on regularly. We have spent the last 10 or 15 years in a more free movement of capital period. We're in fact clearly moving into a less free movement of capital period for the next 15 years or 20 years. So that's not new, but it is an attempt to impose a position. On the other hand, I do want to argue there's something new. And in fact, one of my complaints about the globalization literature is it makes us not see what is in fact really new, which I call transformation and not globalization. That has to do with what I call the structural crisis of the world system. That then gets us into an argument or a discussion of how do capitalists accumulate capital? Well, obviously, they produce things which they sell on the market, and they pocket the difference between the sales price and the total price that they are paying to produce it. And if you look at this total price that they are paying to produce it, it really has 3 major components. One component is everything they pay for labor power, including management, but all their labor power. They have to pay something in one form or another. And the second thing is they have to buy inputs of all kinds, doesn't matter what they are. And the third thing is they have to pay taxes to governmental structures. So my argument is that all 3 components have been going up irremediably. So you have to take them one by one. Why are payments for labor power been going up for 400 years as a percentage of total value created or added? And it's very simple, I think. Payments for labor power is a function of the political rapport de force. And the political rapport de force is always a function of the degree to which laborers syndicalize in some form or other. It doesn't have to be a trade union, but some form of syndical action gets them a larger slice of the pie. And my argument is that workers are always syndicalizing all the time. And they're most likely to do this in areas that are have the largest share of total value accumulated and are the most politically developed, and so forth and so on. And when they successfully syndicalize and therefore get a larger chunk of the profits, in effect, what do employers do? Or industrialists or entrepreneurs or anybody engaged in production. The classic mode of handling syndicalization, especially in downturn periods, is what we call in the United States runaway factories. Production structure from where you are to someplace else where the local labor force is not going to get the same amount of payments. Now, why are they not going to get the same amount of payments? Why should people in, I don't know, Addis Ababa be willing to work for less in building a house than people in Stockholm? Right? Historical patterns? Well, where did these historical patterns come from? I think the essential reason why people are willing to work for less is that there are persons there for whom the less is more. And who are these persons? Basically, anybody who is in a relatively non-monetarized zone, usually rural, who takes one of these jobs which at world levels is very low pay, discovers that for his position, his income level, his real income level, it's an improvement. So he takes it. He's willing, he or she, it's actually quite often women, is willing to work at this lower rate because it's a good deal. Furthermore, the shift from rural areas to urban areas is culturally and politically disorienting, and he's not sure how to operate, and so forth. So he accepts. But that's a generational matter. One generation later, everybody is habituated to living in the towns. They've learned the secrets of what's going on in the rest of the world. Information flows, and they syndicalize in one form or another, and the rate of pay, in fact, goes up. So what does the employer do? He moves. It's, I see production as having simply constantly moved, especially as profit levels go down. So moving requires that there be some place to move to, and this is what I'm saying is being exhausted. I call it the deruralization of the world. We already have dramatically deruralized the world since 1945. And, you know, all of Europe is deruralized. A good portion of the Americas are deruralized. And if you take the rest of the world, Africa, India, China, it's considerably reduced. And 25 years from now, we'll be down to 20% worldwide. People in slum areas in the towns are not the same kind of reserve labor force because they can get real income in various forms, the informal economy, crime, and all sorts of other ways which make them demand reasonably high levels of pay to enter the formal labor force. They are not the same thing as somebody coming from that rural demonetized area or relatively low monetized area. So I just see this as we're hitting this limit. That's one limit. Then there's the limit of the cost of inputs. How do you keep the cost of inputs down? The basic technique of capitalists throughout the history of the capitalist world system is not to pay the bills. How do you not pay bills? Well, you not pay bills by a very simple mechanism which the neoclassical economists have a very fancy word for. It's called the externalization of costs. Externalization of costs means your costs are paid by somebody else. How do you externalize costs? There are three major mechanisms by which you externalize costs. One, you throw your toxic waste into the nearest river. Okay, so somebody may have to clean that up one day, but it's not you, and you haven't paid for cleaning it up. Now that's mechanism number one. The second is you cut down trees, but you don't provide for their regeneration. Okay, somebody else may have to provide for it, but you haven't provided for it. You've reduced your costs. And the third is you need a bridge, and the state builds a bridge for you. Okay, now all three mechanisms are running out. You see, we've got the rivers are all toxic. There are no more trees left to cut down, and bridge building is very expensive. So this is why we have an ecology movement across the world, which we didn't have 100 or 150 years ago, because there were still trees to cut down, there were still rivers to be polluted, and it wasn't so expensive to build bridges. What can you do about it? You can get the government of the world to clean up the waste and to regenerate the trees and to still build the bridges. But in order to do that, they have to raise taxes. We'll come to taxes in a minute. Or you can say to the enterprises, well, gentlemen, you must internalize these costs, which is what various kinds of legislation have been trying to do for the last 20 or 30 years, and about which the entrepreneurs constantly yell, but if you insist on that we internalize these costs, we won't make profit. They are right. They are right. They're absolutely right. And as I say, part of their profit comes from the externalization of the cost, which is why in the United States right now we're arguing about various kinds of rules that Clinton tried to put in and Bush has now revoked, because this is an issue of the internalization of costs. Anyway, the pressure to internalize costs is ceaseless, and therefore profits are going down. And the third is taxation. Well, the tax bill, absolutely true, is just higher than it used to be. I mean, there's a steady upward stream. Nobody paid, no enterprise in 1820 paid anything like the taxes that it's paying in 2001 anywhere in the world. And why are they paying these taxes? In a word, democratization. In order to keep the unwashed masses from being very upset with the world, you throw them bones. What are the bones that you throw them? It's called the welfare state. Okay, the welfare state. What is the welfare state? And the welfare state is not just a Western phenomenon, it's a worldwide phenomenon. The welfare state is really three things, which everybody wants: more education, more health facilities, and guarantees of lifetime income. They don't want the fluctuations of income across one's life. They want to have it guaranteed. So they need things to pay for the children, they need unemployment insurance, they need Social Security, and so forth. In every country, every year, or at least every decade, they want more education than they currently have, more health facilities than they currently have, and more guarantees of lifetime income than they currently have. And the curve has simply been going up. Furthermore, it's spreading. You know, this all started maybe in France and England, but by now every country in the world is under these pressures. And just, you know, Greece wants to have the income of Denmark, and China wants to have the income of Greece, and just start imagining what that means in terms of the world's tax bill and who's going to pay that. I think it's a steady increase. So, structural crisis, okay? It is an economic crisis where the ceaseless accumulation of capital isn't working, won't be working. You know, capitalists work very hard. They are. We should not think of them as loafers. They actually work extremely hard, and they expect something from it. It's called the level of profits and accumulating capital and so forth. If they work very hard and they can't make this, then there's not much point in working that hard, and the whole system can't operate. It doesn't make any sense. And indeed, the first people who will see this is capitalists. It won't make any sense for them to do this, and they will start looking around. They are looking around for alternative ways of maintaining what's crucial for them, which is hierarchy and privilege. Some kind of system that allows polarization of income. It doesn't have to be capitalism. If capitalism has exhausted its possibilities, let's find another system that will do it. I don't know what that system is. They don't even know what that system is yet. They're working on it. So we reach the moment of crisis, which is crisis. We're talking of something that goes on 20, 30, 50 years, right? Where the only thing we can be sure of is that this system won't survive. But what we can't be sure of is what will succeed it, because we come into what the scientists of complexity call a bifurcation.